Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of the Taming the Polar Bear broadcast. This will be for the kind of the preliminary presentation for this week's webinar topic, which is negative self-dialogue. As I've said numerous times, I've talked to a lot of people. I've heard a lot of people's stories. I have my own story. And negative self-dialogue is invariably a thread that runs through most, if not all, cases I've heard or dealt with. It certainly was with mine. Now, this, negative self-dialogue can mean a few different things, I think, but basically we're talking about beating ourselves up, calling ourselves names, putting ourselves down, judging ourselves, blaming ourselves, and it can become a really vicious cycle. Now, we've been talking about depression and, all different things that are going on in depression from kind of a neuroscience point of view and what the experience is like. And if you will recall from our my presentation on depression and some of the factors that will be involved, I mentioned thoughts. And I also, in last week's presentation about the stress response system and depression, I also mentioned thoughts. So I think to frame this whole thing of negative self-dialogue in maybe a little different way than what you're used to thinking of it, we're just going to kind of lump this whole inner dialogue thing in under the general heading of thoughts, because it's just how we're thinking. There's this dialogue and there's a whole interesting kind of way. I'll try to explain this whole inner dialogue thing a little bit. I'm not going to get to it all today. You guys know I can go on at great length about all of these things. I'll try to keep that brief. But this way we kind of talk to ourselves, this inner dialogue is just really a form of thoughts. And, as I've said in various blog posts, none of these thoughts we have, none of these thought patterns we have, none of this way of talking to ourselves has to be there. We probably, not in all cases, but probably have grown up with these kind of thought patterns. I've noticed two quite different camps of people, and these sort of have to be approached perhaps a little differently. But some people, the negative voices, we'll say, sometimes we think of them as negative voices, can often be a parent and often a mother. And that's a little bit different than other cases I've looked at where it really seems to come from, ourselves. And that was me. I mean, I was really blessed with my parents. Like anybody, we got scolded now and again, but, I never had to put up with constant negative talk about me. So, on that note, and we'll come back to this, these two different camps of negative thoughts. I'll just, my own story. Now, I'm trying to remember where this began. I'm thinking my teen years, but now, first of all, I have, I'm bipolar. That's kind of a whole different mind thing altogether that's sort of different and creates different minds and moods and mental states. And with elements of borderline personality disorder, which can cause some really intense mood swings and reactions to things around us. And Sorry, the video paused there. This is kind of a little bit of a different kettle of fish, because I can be, when I'm in a kind of a more up mood and things are okay, my inner dialogue will be, probably, if anything, too positive, and I have to get to that as well. But when I kind of had one of these more short-term mood state changes, probably more best put under the borderline personality disorder umbrella, or if I was in a depressive state, or worse, the most dangerous, what's called a mixed state in bipolar, elements of mania, the energy of mania with the kind of negative mental state of depression. I could really, really, really give myself a thrashing. And, it always kind of been like this, but when, the worst of all this started just under 10 years ago. And, I was just a normal working guy. I had a good job. That kind of changed. I wanted to pursue my own dreams. So I left a $45,000 a year job, very comfortable, secure job, and left that to try pursue my own pursuit of my own art in a business kind of model. I wanted my cake and eat it too, pursue my art and make money at it. And, long story short, I lost everything I'd ever worked for. I lost about $250,000 in savings and equity in the home I had. I lost my home. I lost everything that I had put aside for my daughter, for her education and her future. I went deeply into debt. I destroyed my credit rating. Now, I didn't know this until later, how sick I was with bipolar, and I don't like quite thinking that as mentally sick. It just, there's, as I've tried to explain, there's a lot of physiology that changes, and as my mind and brain both broke down, I lost my ability to earn an income in any way. Even, I had job skills so I could get back into the job market, but I could not do that. After a while, I just physically couldn't work anymore. And that's kind of a whole different story. But through this, needless to say, virtually everything went wrong, a lot of stress. And I had ginormous amounts of guilt and blame, self-blame. And I would beat myself up so bad that, and this, is why I take these kind of negative thoughts seriously, because these things will lead, not will necessarily, but could very well lead to suicidal ideation, suicidal planning, suicidal action, self-harm, and so on. That's kind of the extreme end of the outcome of these kind of negative mental states and negative self-dialogue. And I used to physically beat myself up. And I'm not going to get into that a lot here now, but it's one of the reasons, when I look back at my own experience and how my inner dialogue and thoughts contributed to my mental state. And even when I thought I had things turned around and was doing better, and my mental states kept shifting and going in certain, for me, very dangerous directions. They always went in very dangerous directions for me. Plus, when I learned the power of our thoughts on our own biology, and this is the topic for another day, but how our thoughts are literally toxic. Our thoughts have the power to literally change our biology. A lot of the physiological symptoms, and this, I know this sounds weird, and I'll have to outline this another day. So for now, I'd just like you to take my word for it. But the power of our thoughts will literally kill us. And for me, that was more of an immediate threat because of how my mind worked. But for others, it will be a kind of slower process of damaging your very cellular function. And very interesting, I just came across this in the past week. Your thoughts can actually alter your DNA in ways that shorten life. So, when I say your thoughts can kill you, I'm not exaggerating, I'm not dramatizing. That is what a lot of science is has learned for some time, but the evidence is really starting to solidify. So, people, that's why we take this whole business of thought seriously. And I think I've mentioned this before. No, I don't think I have. Just a second. This is why we take this whole business of thoughts and self-dialogue seriously. Now, when I do my taming the polar bears stuff, and somebody wants to understand what that's all about, and I outline the changes I feel they need to make to get their mental states and their lives going in a better direction. I have my positive difference-making fundamentals, and some of them I think are kind of a soft thing. You can do this or not. It's just something I suggest. But some of them I call them non-negotiable. This has to change, and thoughts and self-dialogue are non-negotiable. No matter where you are, no matter what's going on, anxiety, depression, some kind of life crisis, we have to change how you talk to yourself. So now, as you know, probably there are many approaches to that. And this kind of comes back, I think, a little bit to these two camps I was talking about. Like for some people, this negative inner voice is often kind of a reflection of a mother. And I don't like to blame mothers or heap all kinds of scorn on mothers. Mothers have difficult jobs, but the inescapable fact of many, many people, and especially women, it would seem, it is their negative inner voice is kind of a reflection of how they were spoken to by their mothers, especially, and probably fathers. And that's something we don't really need to get into here. We'll just say a parental figure. Sometimes schools. I've talked to people who grew up in boarding schools, and how they were spoken to there has a strong reflection in their inner voice. I think if we were to go to areas of Asia, certain places in the world with really strong, strict school systems, I think the possibility of a teacher having this kind of lifelong influence may be a little stronger. In any case, sometimes the voices come from some sort of authority figure, we'll say. But other times, as I've said, they seem to come from ourselves. So let's kind of have a little look at what's going on when we have these thoughts, where they come from, why they're hard to control. I'll touch on a few concepts from the blog, things I've written about. I've written about zombie programs. I know nobody likes that word, but they're just autonomously running programs. So they're kind of like our thought habits, action habits. If you prefer, you can kind of think of them as our mental habits. Most of these are well below our conscious awareness. So when I looked into thoughts and where they came from and why thought patterns kind of repeat and why we get stuck in them, and when I understood zombie programs, how much of our actions and thoughts and all these things are kind of subconscious, autonomously running programs, I saw, okay, that makes a lot of sense. These thoughts, if we think of, an habitual reaction to something, we get some kind of input and we'll have kind of a natural reaction to it. It happens kind of without thinking, without conscious thought. And that's sort of the best way for now to think of a zombie program. And if you think of our thoughts, we probably don't put a lot of thought into how we think about ourselves and our inner dialogue. Something happens and it feels like a tape loop. It just runs. So that's, I think, kind of an interesting way to look at it. Now, these so-called programs will be numerous different brain regions involved, and there's all kinds of, they can become kind of set. And this, if we kind of understand it in this context, that our thoughts are produced by certain brain regions into, complicated brain networks, and they just kind of run autonomously, that helps us to understand why they're hard to make go away, why it's hard to break these habits. Now, I think if I talk to most people, negative self-dialogue would come along or go together with some kind of anger, some kind of negative emotion. And that comes back to our stress response system. And thoughts are kind of a really weird thing here, because this kind of stress and anxiety and anger, these emotions kind of create the thoughts. And then the thoughts kind of feed back to fuel the emotions. And if you think of some of your, some of these times where we really get into these difficult periods of beating ourselves up, something will happen. We'll have a strong emotional reaction to that. As hard as we try, these negative thoughts, these thought patterns, all this beating ourselves, blaming ourselves, judging ourselves, calling ourselves hard names, this just starts to happen. Oh, you idiot. Oh, you fat, stupid moron. Oh, how could you be so stupid? And I don't really want to describe it too much because I think it's a little bit too triggering. But I think you know what I mean. So, these are often, if we think back on them, there's probably some kind of intense emotional reaction that came with them, that maybe triggered them. And that comes back to what's going on in our stress response. Now, a lot of what goes on through our head with these thoughts, I cover in the post cognitive distortions. And that's kind of, we want to approach some of these thoughts in that regard as well. I'm not going to get into that too much right now, but that's, I think, a very useful post to look at for many of you to understand, that these things kind of come from our brains, and they're natural kind of, I like to call them cognitive errors. They're producing sort of the wrong thoughts, if we can think of them that way. And just another post I wrote on habit change, why it's hard to change habits, and that's kind of useful to look at here as well. And neuroplasticity. because it's, when I look at all this and how all this works in the brain, and what produces our thoughts, and what kind of goes into any given kinds of thoughts will involve certain brain regions. And I'm going to kind of present an interesting way to look at that and deal with that in a moment. So now the difference-making fundamentals that I think apply to what we want to learn and change here, living one day at a time, and I will get to that sort of towards the end. Mindfulness, cognitive behavior therapy, certainly. Brain training games, my brain training exercises and kind of brain training, mindfulness brain training approaches. But I'm going to start with, self-compassion and forgiveness. I've had some really battles with people on this, and some of you, there's a certain person out there who will know who I'm talking about. People can have, this is really where we kind of have to start. We have to start with self-compassion and forgiveness. I screwed up a lot of stuff in the last 10 years. And, there was a point I knew I couldn't really control this negative, these negative kind of inner outbursts against myself if I didn't learn to forgive myself and have some compassion. Regular readers of the blog will know that the kind of one of the entire premises of the blog and why I write all this brain stuff is what I try to do is kind of, and then this again is kind of weird, but I kind of try to separate us from our brain. There's stuff that goes wrong, creates mistakes, behaviors we don't like. A lot of the stuff that we kind of don't like about ourselves and maybe beat ourselves up for, we didn't create that. That's a long process of how your brain developed. So this has been very powerful for some people. If we can kind of separate ourselves, and I'm going to repeat this theme in a number of different ways. Separate this kind of concept of you, who you are, with what's kind of been created by your brain. Because your brain creates, ultimately creates all your behaviors and stuff. That doesn't mean we're not responsible for them, but the fact is, a lot of the things we do that we regret or don't like about ourselves and beat ourselves up about are things we didn't create. Okay, so let's start there. We have this you and this weird thing called our brain, and we're going to separate them. Okay, so where people who are really big on self-responsibility and taking ownership, and it's great. We have to do that, no question. Kind of take ownership and responsibility for our actions, but these people have the hardest time forgiving themselves and working on self-compassion. Okay, so we have to start there. That's a process. I'll get to this in the end. This is all a process. None of this is going to change overnight. These are little daily things we're going to work on and change. Okay, but it has to begin with self-compassion and forgiveness. And that's a theme I'm probably not going to convince you of today if you're new to this, but regular readers, regular followers will know that I preach this over and over and over again. Don't blame yourself for what your brain does. Okay. Now, I have also found, and what I also teach, when we're trying to change habits, we're trying to change mental patterns and all these things, it's very hard to do that in the hectic, chaotic kind of thing that we call our day-to-day life. So my approach, and this was easier for me because I had more time, and this is more challenging if you're very busy, but we have to set aside periods of time to work on these things. And, this is where, some meditative training comes in handy, where we learn to, kind of block out what's going on around us and work on what's going on in our heads and why. And that's the basis for, how I approach cognitive behavior therapy. And that's kind of the mindfulness meditative approach I take to that. And that's a pretty useful blog post to read. I'll put all this together in a new blog post that helps tie all this together. So don't worry about taking notes and remembering all these things. And I'm going to talk about cognitive behavior therapy in a moment. But if we look at, how I approach brain training exercises and what we can work on when we're, as I like to say, puzzle solving. That's how I approach, I won't make a secret of the fact that we're talking about the card games, and I use the Chinese mahjong games and things like that. But I look at them as solving puzzles. I'm here, there's some kind of puzzle, and I want to get here, a solution. And that's the mental approach I take. And what I do is train myself to take a very objective, non-judgmental way of solving problems. And, all our lives, our day-to-day lives, and I've talked about this regarding the stress response system and what, constitute a lot of stressors. If there's problems being put on our plate, and a lot of the anxiety and stress we have is, we're having trouble coming up with solutions and approaches to problems. So that's how I approach the brain training. It's a quiet space away from all the pressure of life where I can mentally practice this approach, this mental approach, how, instead of getting frustrated, upset, throwing in the towel, giving up. And I've got a whole different talk on the brain training games, but all these things tie together. So I'll touch on them a little bit here and there today. So instead of, kind of all these negative reactions, no matter what happens, I tell myself, okay, just slow things down and think it through carefully. Let's try to solve this. And taking a calm, more mindful approach, I find I can get way more solutions than when I'm in a kind of a frustrated, quick reaction kind of state. So that's kind of the general mental training I do there. But what I also found was this was a great way to work on how I talk to myself. Now that this is in the post on the brain training exercises, but I'll just mention it here. As we, take this quiet, focused activity where we're blocking things out, and I'll get into other activities or suggest other activities where we can do this as well, because I know a lot of you probably don't want to waste your time playing card games on the computer. But anyways, as I go through and just try to work out the steps and get the best solutions and results I can, I pay a lot of attention to my inner dialogue. So now these are a couple of the steps I really want you to work on. Okay, now back to us and what's going on. I want you to learn to separate you from the issue. Okay, so something goes wrong, you make a mistake. Our natural inclination, if we're used to beating ourselves up, we'll say, you idiot, or, what a stupid mistake you did, something like that. And, this is where we're going to start. So when you're doing, whatever activity, and again, we'll talk about different activities we can practice this with in a moment. But when we're doing this activity, we're going to have a mental dialogue going on in our head, right? Whether we're knitting or sewing or cooking, all these kinds of activities, we have a dialogue going on in our head. So this is where, we want to work on this. So if something goes wrong, you make a mistake, you drop something, and your normal reaction would be to call yourself a name or, say what an idiot you are, something like that. We're going to stop and just replace that with something else. And we'll say, that was a mistake, not you made a mistake, that was a mistake. We're going to separate ourselves from the action. Okay, and this was a classic I learned teaching school. When I was teaching young children, I was trained, to never say something against them specifically. It separates the person from the behavior. The behavior is wrong, not the person. Okay, and I want you to learn to apply that to yourself. So this, mistake or whatever it is that happened, something you feel you want to beat yourself up about, sorry, we're going to say, it's that action, that was a mistake, not we're stupid or we did something wrong. This was the wrong approach. Okay, and I'm going to, again, I have other broadcast presentations where we're going to work on this. There's a number of ways we're going to approach this, and today's just kind of an introduction to a lot of these things. But I want you to get that idea. Take some kind of an activity. And I want you to approach it kind of mindfully, slow everything down, even if it's something you kind of think you can do in your sleep. We're going to slow the process down, and it's necessary to do that so we can kind of, pay more attention to what's going on in our head and, beginning the process of changing that. Okay. Now, it's just, I did so many things together when I was working on this, and it's, as I try to teach individual parts, I find it really difficult without referring to and kind of touching on the importance of other things. Meditation is important for a number of reasons, and I need a whole presentation on meditation, and I see that's not part of the May schedule, but we'll get there, and I'll touch on meditation here and there. But when we learn to meditate, when we learn, and there's different approaches to meditation, and people get weirded out by meditation, but we're just going to look at really simple techniques that just kind of help us slow things down and stop what's going on, whatever it is. We just slow things down, and it brings a lot of things going on in our head and body, kind of slows them down a little bit, and we can approach things. The different simple approaches I take to meditation are kind of really designed to help with impulse control. Now, nobody quite likes to think of themselves as impulsive, but if you think of all these thoughts that you just allow to burst into your head and kind of take control, that's kind of an impulsive reaction to something. Okay, so when we learn to kind of meditate and train our focus on something, even for a few moments, this trains our brain to kind of slow down impulse urges and these so-called intrusive thoughts. So, when we kind of learn a little bit about this meditation, and then start paying a little more attention to our thoughts, and start replacing, this negative little, we'll just start really small. It's important to start really small, simple things, instead of, you idiot. Oh, okay, that was the wrong thing to do, or that was a stupid thing to do. We can say the thing was stupid, the action, but we don't have to say ourselves, because we're not stupid, okay? We make mistakes, we're human, and I know you all hear that and try to tell yourselves that, but I think it helps to hear it in a context of kind of how I approach it with all this brain stuff. Your brain's just going to make errors. It's just really unrealistic to expect your brain not to make errors. And coming back to stress and depression, those things impact our cognitive abilities, our ability to, think straight. You know what I'm talking about. We get into these stress, and we feel we literally can't think straight. So mistakes are going to happen. So let's try, again, to separate you from what's going on in your brain, because that's way, way down in deep systems. And we're going to, a lot of this is working on, getting this you to control what's going on down here in our brain. But, right now, when we go through all these, boy, and I will write a book on this, what bipolar does to me up here. It's powerful stuff. So we want to start small, little step-by-step things. And I'll kind of recap this at the end, and we'll get to this more in the webinar on Sunday. So we just learned to take, just to kind of recap what I just said here with brain training, we want to take some kind of activity, whether you're knitting, sewing, take some kind of hobby that you like, and we're going to slow that process down. And I want you to pay attention to your inner dialogue as you go through that. And I want you to just start putting the idea in your head that, those thought patterns don't have to be there. We're going to change them and recreate them. Okay, and I've got something to add a little bit towards the end about our inner narrative and how powerful that can be. Okay, now so when you're doing your activity, slow things down, pay attention to what you're going on in your head, how you're talking to yourself, and I want you to start catching these little kind of negative jabs at yourself and replacing those with something else. And like I said, just the simple thing, a mistake happens, you didn't make a stupid mistake. That was a stupid mistake. This is powerful. I know it seems really simplistic, but this is where we start, okay? Separate you from what went on, okay? And this is where, speaking of which, this is really important. I almost forgot. A big part of what we're going to, a habit we're going to break is the whole blame game. What I like to call the blame game. And this is, a really, really common habit. Something goes wrong, somebody has to be to blame. And, this is hard to escape. Huge parts of our, justice system and, approach to discipline and, every family, it's kind of like this. Something happens, somebody has to be the blame. So this is a really hard habit for people to break, but this is a major, major, major cornerstone of my blog and why I talk about how the brain creates these kind of separately from who we are. And that is try to get people away from the blame game. So, this is why I talk and try, and again, to separate, you. And again, I'm not saying you're not responsible in some level, but to get away from this blame for what went wrong. We're just, this takes a lot of work throughout the blog and a lot of things I talk about. But this is why we need to understand, these are things going on in your brain that you didn't consciously create. You're just kind of the end recipient of them. Okay? So we want to get away from blaming ourselves, blaming others, and just looking at so many of these things that upset us as something we can either solve or let go. And I'll talk about that a little more later as well. Okay, so I hope that's kind of clear on what we're, how you're going to start retraining your brain and paying attention to your inner dialogue and changing little ways of how you speak to yourself. Boy, I'm tempted to get into the cognitive behavior therapy thing, but I think that's going to be a bit of a stretch here for today, and I'm already running a bit long. A bit long. Another approach I want to try and consider, and again, this is going to take more work, and then this is really just an introduction. Another thing I found with studying the brain and what it creates in our minds, I'm sure you're all kind of you're familiar with the feeling of having, it seems like a lot of different voices in our head and points of view. And, we'll be kind of encouraging to ourselves here and beating ourselves up there. And when I talk to a lot of people, this can be this kind of cacophony going on in our head. And, I think it's kind of, I find it's quite important to, this kind of approach is important. Now I want to, this is kind of the model I came up with for myself. We have lots of different ways of looking at ourselves, and the brain is like this. It has all kinds of different regions that look at ourselves and evaluate ourselves in certain ways, in different ways. And, what a lot of we experience as voices is just these kind of different ways of self-evaluation. So, a lot of people refer to the negative voice as their inner critic. And, a lot of approaches is just trying to silence that inner critic. And, understanding as I do, the brain regions involved in creating this so-called inner critic, I realize, actually that's a really important part of us. So this is another way I want you to try and approach it. The inner critic is really important. There's the inner critic, and then kind of related, but a little bit different, is that person who's driving ourselves to be better. A lot of, for some of us, especially for really self-driven, perfectionism is kind of a big, important angle to look at here. It's just our brain's way of driving ourselves and kind of kicking ourselves in the butt. And for a lot of self-driven, self-motivated people, that kind of drive is going to have this inner critic voice. And this is, again, what I think a lot of, some people, especially really self-driven, self-motivated people, have trouble turning that off, because on some level they know it's kind of important to themselves, or important to how they kind of drive themselves. And that was certainly me for a lot of things. You know, I made mistakes. I could get lazy and kind of lackadaisical about doing things, and I'd, you know, get into trouble for that. And then this kind of inner slave driver critic would kick into action, and people would tell me, you know, not to be so hard on myself. And I think a lot of you can identify with this. And you know, I'd look at it two ways. You know, if I'm not hard on myself, somebody else will be. And my approach was, you know, if somebody's going to be hard on me, I'd rather it be me rather than somebody else. So, you know, I have a strong sense that a lot of you can identify with that. And the inner critic just kind of went along with that. You know, there'd be this person within ourselves pushing, you know, come on, don't be, you know, don't slack off, don't do this, you know, go, drive, work harder. And we're striving, you know, for some kind of really perfect, ideal outcome. And the inner critic is just there kind of nagging us if we do anything wrong. So, you know, so for a lot of us, trying to make that go away, I don't think is going to happen. And when I hear advice to just kind of tell the inner critic to shut up and things like that, and that apparently works for some people, but I think for a lot of us, especially if we've got a lot of depressive anxiety and some life chaos stuff going on, you know, it's like a Band-Aid on a boiler. You know, kind of holds, and you know, I bet dimes to donuts, you guys know exactly what I'm talking about. It holds, and all of a sudden, pow, and it just rip. You know how vicious it can get. I don't need to explain that. So, my approach to that, and I have a couple of different approaches to that. You know, I kind of decided, you know, these different brain regions that create all these different ways of analyzing ourselves and pushing ourselves and criticizing ourselves. I kind of decided to look at them as kind of like a board of directors in our head. And oh, here's Mrs. Bean. Sorry. Sorry, board of directors in our head. And there's actually some interesting you know, cognitive neuroscience type stuff on this, that, you know, our brains are kind of a team of rivals, that there is a lot of rival things going in on our brain. So I decided, okay, let's look at all these different things as a board of directors. And they all, you know, it's like a board. They're all going to have their say. This you know, logical person is going to have their say, and you know, this critic is going to have his say, and so on and so forth. And what I learned was, and this kind of, and I tie this into the cognitive behavior therapy, which I don't think I'll get to today, but we will eventually. You know, if we learn to just hear these things, and this can be a little crazy making, but bear with me. You know, if we just kind of hear these things, and well, actually, I will I will touch on the cognitive behavior therapy. You know, and if we kind of hear these things, and instead of, you know, trying to repress them, and kind of give that particular voice in our head an answer, and then act on that, you will actually find a lot of these things will start to calm down. You know, because you know, as I explained, you know, about our stress response system, a lot of it is tied to, you know, paying attention to what's going on in ourselves, and, you know, what we need to do. Sorry, Mrs. what we need to do. And if we kind of don't pay attention to that, or sort of deal with that in some way, that little bit of the stress response won't turn off. It kind of wants an answer or some kind of action. So on that note, and my printer, I couldn't get my printer to work, so I had to draw up my own thing. When we, and again, I have, I've got a whole different presentation and webinar on cognitive behavior therapy, but just to introduce this idea and give you, some things to work on a little bit here. We have our thoughts, we have our feelings. Mrs. Bean's playing with my cord here. We have our thoughts, feelings, behavior, and like I say, these things will work in a cycle. Our thoughts will affect our feelings will affect our behavior will affect our behavior will affect our thoughts. Our thoughts will affect our feelings will, these things can roar around in a cycle. So, a lot of what I'm trying to set the table here for is what does some of these mindfulness approaches and kind of slowing this down with the brain training exercises is, if we kind of more mindfully, sorry, that's my lighting's not very good here, kind of slow down and work on these things, we will start to calm down those inner critics and inner beating ourselves up voices. Okay. So, this all kind of goes around our core beliefs. And there's you, the future, and others. We don't have to worry about these things too much right now. Let's just kind of focus on you here for now. And kind of what we can be really powerful. And, and I tie this in how the stress response, this inner monitor that's kind of working within us and creating a lot of these thoughts. And, these thoughts kind of demand answers and actions. We kind of simply put for now, we create some different thoughts. The thoughts create a little bit different feelings. Behavior, we're just going to think of that as action, our daily actions. And I'll tie that into the one day at a time approach. If we create some kind of thought, and we create a little bit different feeling with that thought. So, we started off with negative, shitty thoughts. It creates negative, shitty feelings, creates negative, shitty behaviors and actions and results in ourselves. That creates more shitty feelings or more shitty thoughts, and we get this negative cycle going on. So we kind of, as I like to tell people, we want to just kind of get a toehold or beachhead. And we just start by changing a couple of thoughts. And then we try to, with those new thoughts, try to create a little bit better feelings. Then we use this to create a little bit more positive action behavior that creates a little better outcome. Now, if we get a little better outcome, and it's odd when people get into really terrible depressive states and really terrible mental thought patterns, see even positive outcomes will be looked at negatively. We'll think, you're just lucky. That was, we can take even the good and make it negative. So, this is really some hard work for some people. And I hope I'm giving you some kind of encouraging, positive inspiration that you can do it, because you can. You know, I won't today, but another day I'll tell you how much this was destroying me and how important it was to turn this around. But we just start with a little beachhead. Let me put this down for a second. And this is why it's important that we really set aside, you know, if you can just set aside, 10, 20, 30 minutes once or twice a day where you're going to kind of mindfully focus on these things. And the mindfulness cognitive behavior therapy is kind of a topic for another day. But just where we can kind of slow down and put ourselves, as I say in the blog post on mindfulness CBT, we really want to get ourselves into a kind of a non-judgmental, non-blameworthy state. And we're just going to go through these things slowly. Sometimes just start with the one thought, one kind of way of talking to ourselves, and change that a little bit. Try to build on that to change how we feel about ourselves a little bit. And it's really important to tie it in with some kind of action, because it just, when I look at the stress response system and why it gets locked on, what it's really looking for is some kind of result. So this is why these all have to tie together. Behavior, I'm just going to try to, actions that bring some sort of result or some sort of behavior or way of doing something that's going to create a better result. And, that's kind of why where this inner power, and how much power these thoughts have, at their real core, they want an action that gets some kind of satisfying result. And, there's, like I say, if we go back to our little boardroom analogy, there's these different voices. And, in the long run, what I'm going to teach you is how to be a better CEO of all these different kind of parts of us that have all these different things to say. That's a long-term goal. This takes time. But where we want to kind of start, and this kind of, it says core beliefs, but this kind of literally goes down to the core of how our brain works and why it's firing these signals that create all these negative, powerful reactions, is just looking for some sort of result. Okay, now I know we're getting a little bit long here, so I know everybody really wants some quick answers, and I'm afraid we can't do that in a single session. So I've given you something to think about and a different way to think about approaching how you think, because this is the long goal. This is where we're heading. What I really want you to do, like a lot of these feelings are there for a reason. Things in our life are not right, and our brain wants those turned around, and it's really on our case about that. So, but it ironically becomes self-defeating, even if it kind of feels like we're successful. Become self-defeating, self-sabotaging. And as I said at the beginning, eventually these things, they're toxic. They will damage you in some way. So as I said, these, changing this is non-negotiable, but it starts, and just, I'm just trying to plant a seed that, these thoughts, these torture, these kind of self-torturing inner mental states and thoughts don't have to be there. But at the same time, they're produced by very powerful parts of your brain. It's going to take you know, a lot of this kind of working on this little basic cycle here to get this going in a better way. Core beliefs, we're going to have to talk about another time. That's a little deeper into the cognitive behavior therapy when we start questioning, you know, our, you know, what's going on in our core that's creating a lot of this stuff. But for today, I want to leave you with one day at a time. This is really important for all of this stuff. This was really important with a lot of the people I worked with, you know, because we're going to have horrible days. There's just going to go, lots of stuff's just going to go wrong. This isn't going to turn around overnight. But if we work on, you know, reducing the load on our brain in a literal sense to the day, you know, what can we do in this day? This gets a lot of the stress off our brain, and you know, and again, I'll put the links and lay this out in a blog post. But one day at a time, you know, if I can get to start working on the habit, you wake up, you know, some of us wake up quite slowly, or some days we wake up slowly, some days we wake up at the start, lots of things going on in our head. And we start to sort of remember this new mental process. Okay, we're going to slow things down a little bit. All these thoughts in my head don't have to be there. Start replacing how you talk to yourself, and just try to outline what can you do in this day. You're not going to solve your life in one day, okay? So all you can do is break it down to what you can do in that day. This will begin to help reduce the stress that's creating a lot of this negative inner dialogue and the anxiety that creates a lot of this inner dialogue. You know, what can I do in this day? As we start to learn these better mental habits and mental kind of problem solving approaches, we kind of get through our day a little bit better. And at the end of the day, you know, there's going to be things that went well, there's going to be things that went not well. And again, we're going to separate ourselves from that. People have a lot of trouble giving themselves credit for good things. This is a whole different training thing. People have a lot of trouble with this. So we're going to learn to try to say, okay, I did some of these things well, or some of these things went okay. And just sort of, you know, when I did that, I worked on this every day, I'm telling you. You know, give ourselves a little more credit for some things that went well, some things went not well. Again, we're going to separate ourselves from the things that went not well. And we're just going to try think of, you know, how could we approach that differently? How can we resolve that in a different way? Often we're not going to have the answers. You know, this is where a lot of people get into so much mental distress, is thinking, you know, we get trapped into thinking we have to have all the answers now. And that's just simply not realistic. So at the end of the day, regardless of what happened, we're just going to get into the habit of letting that day go. You know, we did the best we could. Whatever happened, good or bad or indifferent, we just, you know, even if you kind of know it wasn't the best you could, but it was the best you could do on that day, and you let it go. And, you know, and I have some more to say on that, and I know that sounds kind of simple, but I need you to start thinking about breaking things down to what you can do that day. Keep your focus on what you can do on that day, and not, you know, all the stuff that went on in the past, and, you know, all these worries we have about the future. Break it down little bits a day, get through this part, get through this part. And at the end of the day, you know, we have to come to some kind of peace with how well we did, and then let that day go. And the next day we start again, just making yourself a promise you're going to get through that day and that day only as well as you can. Okay? And now, for a lot of people who are in difficult mental states, because their life has gone wrong, and like I said in the post, the part on depression, introducing depression, we can, there's always going to be this biological stuff that's created a lot by mental stuff. But we kind of can't escape the fact that we're really not happy with where we are. And, and everybody wants to change that. But what I found, and what I'm going to try and teach you, and I have all kinds of different personal anecdotes and different ways of doing this, and this sounds kind of corny, but it's absolutely true, and I'll get you there to believing this. You change your thoughts. You change your inner narrative, the story you're writing for your life. Okay, our lives don't just happen. They happen day by day, and that day is going to go according to the script you write yourself. So what we do, the whole bigger picture, this whole thing of changing our thoughts and inner dialogue, is keeping, we work on things day by day, but we keep this big picture in mind, that we change our inner dialogue, we change our narrative, we change our lives. And I guess at some point I'll have to get to a post on how that worked for me. Because if I told you, and I can't today, we've already taken too much time, if I outlined where I was at certain points in the past and how dire things looked like, both in my life circumstances and what was going on in my head, and where I am today, the people who do know that story a little bit find it unbelievable, remarkable, miraculous. I've heard all kinds of things. And, I've done a lot of things, but it boiled down to changing my inner thoughts, changing my self-dialogue, and literally rewriting the narrative in my mind for my life. Okay, so that's where we're going to get you. And, it's a process. I have to remind you, please don't expect quick answers. There are little steps we can work on. But, this is why I talk about the structure of the brain and things. When we're changing these things, we have to, we're literally changing brain structure and how our brains create, our mental states and what goes on, what we experience in our head. They're kind of, it's a very weird thing in philosophy. They're the same and not the same and separate. So this is why I study this stuff. So, I need to kind of take the frustration away from you. If you understand this is a process of changing little micro bits of your brain and how that creates your dialogue and thoughts and all these things, it's what kind of upsets me about a lot of advice. There's this expectation that we can just turn these things around. We can't. Okay, so I need you to understand that. We have this big picture. We're going to change your narrative, change your life, change your inner dialogue, bring you more inner peace, all these things we're kind of looking for. But it's a process. There's little skills we have to master, little skills we have to learn and master. And people who've been doing this with me for a while will be able to tell you this. And so, in our case, what we're looking at here today, these this really, really harsh inner dialogue that, like I say, this is harming you, not in a imaginary way. It is literally harming you, and it's, I think you understand. It's really impacting your life and your goals. So, there's little ways we chip away at changing that. We put in our minds, we're going to rewrite the narrative for our lives, and you are what you think. So, if we change that, who you are and what's going on in your life will change in ways I can tell you can't imagine right now. Okay? So I am going to tie that off. I will see you at the webinar on Sunday, where you can ask all kinds of questions, and we'll try to stay on topic. And little by little, we'll work on this. Like I said, today's just an introduction. Kind of get into your head that thoughts don't have to be there. We can change them. We are going to change them. We're going to create a new narrative and way for a lot of mental inner workings. How you mentalize a lot of things. And there are a lot of other little aspects that are life that we work on, and they all kind of tie together. So today's an introduction. And I hope I planted some different seeds in your mind. And I just want you to believe, no matter where you are today, how things are going, there's if we can think of it as this nasty bit of jungle, there's another side to that. As difficult as it seems right now, you don't have to stay where you are. That does not have to be your life. These don't have to be your thoughts. It can change, and we will get you there. Okay, so bye for now. Thanks for tuning in.